Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Judith and to Dennis for these very impressive presentations. I'm afraid I didn't bring any photos and I have nothing to show, which is even in the slightest way as impressive as what we've seen. So, seriously, very big thank you for sharing your stories. Now, I am maybe a few words to start with on myself. I'm a German diplomat. I'm a member of the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin. I joined the German Foreign Ministry in 1991, and as Dennis said, I served in a couple of countries. My posting now is the Consulate General in San Francisco. Germany has one embassy in the US, in Washington, of course, in the capital, but because the country is so important to us and because there are so many people with connections to Germany, or so many people we would like to have connections with Germany, we also have 8 consulates general in the United States, one of them being in San Francisco, and the Consul General in San Francisco is like leading a smallish place which is like a very, very micro way of an embassy. So we have a cultural department and a political department and an economic department, etc. And of course, a department dealing with all the law and paperwork issues of Germans who live in the US or people who have dual citizenship. Now, I'm here and I was asked, and I'm very happy to be here. And first of all, I would also like to thank the organizers of the exhibition, which I had the chance to look at downstairs. I had known the exhibition, and by training also I'm a historian, so I have maybe a few personal words. I've had a long history of friendship with people in Israel because my school already in 1976 established a cooperation with a gymnasium, with a high school in Tel Aviv, and we had a pupils exchange, and since then we've been in very good contact with people in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, and we're still friends. And also I developed a certain interest in what was called, and I studied that for some time also, it was called the last phase of survivors literature. It was basically the literature written by people who had survived horrible experiences, horrible concentration camp experience, and then managed to build up their own lives. And only when they turned 70, 75, 80, their grandchildren said, "Now grandma, if you don't write this down, this will be lost." And many of these people then started remembering, you know, the times they had, and writing basically a book about their experience in those days. Now, but I'm tempted to talk a little bit, or a lot more about these days, but you know, I'm here for it, and I was asked to tell you a little bit about Jewish life in Germany now. And so I would like to ask you to fast forward a little bit into like today's period. Of course, after the Second World War, and I would just like to mention that because I think it distinguishes the experience we had in Germany for various reasons from very many other experiences of countries which had a horror regime which committed awful crimes. In Germany, at the end of 1945, we were made to understand, the German population was made to understand that the Holocaust and all the atrocities committed there were a singular, horrible, awful event which actually took place. So we did not only have the Nuremberg trials, where the top political guard of the Nazi regimes were trialed by an international court, and many of them hanged, and many of them, you know, put to death in some way or another. But we also had policies in the various parts of Germany which were occupied by the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets, of course, where people were forced to visit the concentration camps very briefly after they had been liberated in order to show the population what had happened. So what I'm trying to say is, like, there were of course, old Nazis continuing to live in Germany, in East Germany and in West Germany, and many of them. But there was quite a substantial number of people whom I would personally believe that they were sort of on a different track after 1945 than before, because also they were forced to see what this horrible regime had done. And of course, the majority of people knew in theory, but there was also a difference between knowing and hearing about rumors about political opponents and Jews being killed in incredible numbers, and actually seeing the sights and seeing what was done to these people. This just as a general introduction. If I talk about Jewish life, before I talk about Jewish life in Germany today, maybe just to give a very brief idea of what happened next. The official position of any German West Germany, now I'm speaking of West Germany because if I would try to speak about East Germany, which you all know, reunification of the two parts of Germany only happened in 1990. That would be a slightly different story. I'm a typical West German, so what I am referring to is my West German experience. There was the official position that was basically taken over the understanding, but also the interpretation of history, which was now provided for by the Allies. So the official position of the government, the official position in education, the official position everywhere was, we had committed these atrocities, and this official position was basically taught in schools, and it was taken as a general assumption and conviction that this has happened, and this is the same until today, and that's the way it was, and that is a good thing. Why am I saying this? Because, of course, I mentioned that there were millions of people who knew what was happening in Germany, and they all still lived in Germany, and they were not, in their majority, transformed into wonderful people loving democracy and the equality of people and the human rights. But it was a longish process, and it took several decades in Germany. And also one of the marks in that process, it took several decades in Germany until people fully and completely internalized this official new reading of history. And one of the marks, which was awfully important, was the Auschwitz trials in the 1960s, which also contributed very strongly to movement in Germany, which was in very large numbers supported and carried forward by the young generation, by the students who performed in the 1967, 68, 69 years what was called the student revolt in Germany. You had in the late 60s, we had a domestic sort of revolutionary movement in the US, and we had very much of that in Germany. And it completely changed our West German society. And the slogan of that era was, the students were protesting against, and now I can say it in German because it sounds so nice, it was against den Muff von 1000 Jahren unter den Talaren. So the Muff of 1,000 years, the Muff is like the very bad smell, the stinky smell of 1,000 years, and that's the Nazi days, unter den Talaren, and the Talaren were the official gowns, lawyers and important people, heads of cities, mayors would carry on official days. So it was a movement to really push out that old style of thinking out of very many of the post-war elites in Germany, in West Germany. So we did need a long time to really get to the point where I was, I'm not coming into the picture, but when I was at school, and I must say my teachers, most of them, all of them, were sort of educated in West Germany in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and in my school experience, the fact that we Germans were responsible for the Holocaust was really a topic, an issue present in so many fields in the teaching, and it was good that it was like that. We analyzed Hitler's and Goebbels' speeches. We analyzed how it was, or we tried to understand how it was possible that large parts of society didn't acknowledge the facts that were happening, even though the vast majority of them knew in some way or another what was happening. So I'm just saying this in order to show this was a transformation of a way of thinking, which also in West Germany, which is now very often quoted as a country which has had a successful history of dealing with their history. So even though that is the case, and I do believe that it is the case, it's not something which happened from one day to another, but it took a long time. And it took a long time, many thousands and millions of people who really had to understand over a period of time what happened, and the fact that their parents were involved in some way or another, and that they would have to drive out this horrible, stinking smell of Nazi days over decades. It was not something which happened from now to then. Okay. Sorry for this long introduction, but now I would like to mention a few words, and basically I would like you to understand this as an offer. I have like 3 or 4 topics which I will briefly mention and say a few words about, and then I would invite you to ask questions, and we can do a Q&A if you would like to do that. I'm here until our plane leaves, whatever, at 6 in the evening, so we have time. What I was going to mention, I'm not sure, I really put this in my book while I was listening, thanking Judith, thanking Dennis, but of course thanking the center to organize this, to get the exhibit here, to have it running for a couple of weeks, all the work which is connected to that, the volunteers, Deidre, and everyone who was involved. These things can only happen if people are really dedicated, and I really wanted to thank you for that. And not only for today's event, but also for keeping the exhibition here for such a long time. Now, some facts about Jewish life in Germany after the Second World War. So in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there were only, understandably, very few people of Jewish belief in West Germany. People think it was between 20,000 and 45,000 until the late 1980s. We don't have, West Germany, thank God, we don't have registration according to beliefs or anything, so we don't know that, but many, the majority of people registered in their Jewish communities, and that's why we have some figures. That most of these people were what we would call very assimilated, liberal, Jewish people, bourgeois people with good education, living in many places, but it was a very, very, very small number of people. That changed in 1989, 1990, 1991. Why was that? Because the Soviet Union dissolved, and the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his government, they decided to grant the to grant basically a visa, asylum status to everyone who exited the former Soviet Union on the grounds that he or she said, I'm Jewish, and because of that I was what does that mean? Disadvantaged, thank you, Dennis. And therefore, basically, these people were allowed to move to Germany. And so we had a large influx of Jewish people from the former Soviet Union. A large influx, meaning like, if we assume that in 1988 there were about 50,000 people or 45,000 people of Jewish belief in Germany, a couple of years later we had 150,000 to 180,000 people, and that's about the figure we would assume is the situation nowadays. Many of these people who came from the former Soviet Union, of course, on the one hand, it was not popular to practice any religion in the former Soviet Union. It was disencouraged by the government. Some people were really treated badly because of that. So also many of the people who came didn't have a clue about Judaism. They had not really any Jewish education. They didn't know many of them didn't know a lot about the traditions. They didn't have a consciousness of being Jewish, but they saw it rather as a chance to escape sort of a world power in decline, that is the Soviet Union, and to come to Germany, a country from which they hoped to get successful living and build up their lives and earn some money and have a good life. So many of these people didn't have a very strong Jewish background. Others had, of course, and some of those others who did were rather on the Orthodox side, on the very strict side. And so all of that led to the fact that in German Jewish communities in the cities, there was we had a couple of years in which these various factions were fighting against each other, because some were very liberal. Then was the question, Germany is the German government wants every Jewish or every religious denomination wants to have their association, because the government wants to have someone to speak to who has a legitimate claim to speak in the name of whatever the Jewish or the Muslim or the Baha'i people. So it's very important in German politics, who's the president of the Jewish organization in Germany, and there were fights about, these, I'm exaggerating now, very liberal, well-established, let me just say something, this is not official, Nancy Pelosi-like Westernish people as a president, or whether it's rather someone who is a very strong more Orthodox Jewish. And now you had these funny figures of people. So in Berlin, for example, there were various new synagogues created, and sometimes they were really fighting each other. Now this has all developed in a good direction in the last couple of years. We do have they all found an understanding, and of course the different factions exist. But the thing is that this gave also a huge chance for Jewish life in Germany. After what we had done, now we have the 4th largest Jewish community in Europe, in Germany, and you have so many German Jews who like to live in Germany, and I'll come to the problems of new anti-Semitism, etc. later on. But in general, there is a situation, if you look at the situation, compare it to the early 1950s, nowadays in Germany you have a situation where you have many more Jews than anyone would ever have dreamt of in Germany again. And also our state politics have always continued this position, which I described in the beginning as the official position. We were, on the one hand, acknowledging very strongly and very clearly all the responsibility we have. On the other hand, we were supporting the re-emergence of Jewish life in Germany. And one of the major steps in that was the decision of Chancellor Kohl to actually grant the Jewish people from the Soviet Union who wanted to come to Germany the right to come to Germany, settle and stay. So that is, of course, a chance for us, and the government also regularly supported sort of Jewish life, also financially, and I'm not talking of compensation, that's another question I'll briefly touch on, but there was also state support on a central level. Annually about 3.3 million euros is given nowadays still to the Central Committee of German Jews in order to help organizing themselves, to help supporting. That's not a hell of a lot of money, but this comes in addition to the compensation payments, etc., which I will mention, as I said. So in general, the German government has been supportive of that. Now, compensation policies, I don't know if you are particularly interested in that. It's a long history, and of course it is a history which mirrors, on the one hand, the fact that we do acknowledge all the horrible things we did, they mirror also the fact that you can never compensate, funny word, stupid word, the losses by financial means, and you can never, really make good to help. But from very early on, our German government has supported victims and relatives of victims, supported Jewish organizations, have supported the State of Israel, etc., with major amounts of money. The official figure, which I read up before coming here because I don't know that by heart,